Do you know that in roughly 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people were murdered not by foreign army, but largely by people who lived among them? Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the people you traded with, worshipped with, greeted every day, or even called friends had suddenly been told that you no longer deserve to live. It sounds unimaginable, yet in 1994, the nightmare became a reality in Rwanda. The genocide against the Tutsi became one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The genocide did not begin with machetes. It began years earlier with political manipulation, ethnic classification, fear, propaganda, discrimination, war, and the gradual transformation of neighbors into enemies. So, how did Rwanda get there? Before the genocide, long before European colonialism, the territory we now know as Rwanda was home to three social communities, commonly identified as the Twa, the Hutu, and the Tutsi. The Twa were traditionally associated with hunting and forest-based livelihood. The Hutu was predominantly agriculturalists, while the Tutsi were associated with Katsu. Hutu and Tutsi shared the same language, culture, religion, and territory. People could intermarry and social status could change over time. By the 16th century, the Kingdom of Rwanda had developed into a centralized monarchy under a king named Mwami. Although Tutsi elites had significant political power within the kingdom, Hutu and Tutsi remained deeply interconnected. Then, European colonialism changed the meaning of these identities. After the First World War, Belgium took control of Rwanda under a League of Nations mandate. Belgian administrators embraced racial theories popular in colonial Africa. At that time, particularly the Hamitic hypothesis, the belief that the Tutsi were somehow racially superior and closer to the Europeans. Governments therefore relied heavily on Tutsi elites in administration while restricting many Hutu from education and political opportunities. Then came one of the most consequential decisions of the colonial period. In the 1930s, the Belgian administration introduced identity cards that permanently classified Rwandans as Twa, Hutu, and Tutsi. An identity that had previously been more fluid was now placed on an official document, and decades later, those same identity cards helped determine who lived or who died. After the Second World War, African nationalism spread across the continent. In Rwanda, political tensions intensified. Many Hutu demanded an end to what they saw as Tutsi political domination, while many Tutsi leaders feared losing the privileges they had acquired under colonial rule. Belgium gradually shifted its support from the Tutsi towards Hutu political movement. Then in November 1959, violence erupted after Hutu political activist Dominic Mbonumutwa was attacked. Rumors spread that he had been killed. Those rumors helped ignite what became known as the Hutu Revolution. Tutsi homes were attacked and burned, thousands were killed, and more than 100,000 Tutsi fled into neighboring countries. When Rwanda became independent on 1st July 1962, political power passed to the Hutu majorly under Gregoire Kayibanda. For many Hutu, independence represented liberation from a system they believed had excluded them. For many Tutsi refugees, however, independence marked the beginning of exile. In the 1960s, some Tutsi refugee groups launched armed incursions into Rwanda, hoping to return to power. The attacks largely failed, but the government used them to justify further repression against Tutsi civilians inside Rwanda. And the cycle continued. Regional events made the situation even worse. The deepened ethnic fear throughout the region and was used by the Rwanda politicians to reinforce the argument that the Tutsi political power represented an existential threat. Meanwhile, President Kayibanda's government was facing accusation of corruption, favoritism, and regional discrimination. Northern Hutu military officer became increasingly dissatisfied. One officer was rising through the ranks. His name was Juvenile Habi Arimana, President Kayibanda's opposite. 5th July 1973, Habi Arimana seized power in a military coup. He promised stability, national unity, and an end to political disorder. Instead, Rwanda became a one-party state. Large-scale massacre became less frequent, but discrimination did not disappear. Tutsi faced restrictions in education, employment, and political participation. Ethnic quotas limited opportunities, while senior positions in the military government remained heavily controlled. Their children had never even lived in the country their parents called home. Among these refugees were young men who had gained military experience fighting alongside Yoweri Museveni during Uganda's civil war. They eventually formed the Rwanda Patriotic Front, or RPF, initially led by Fred and later militarily led by Paul Kagame. The RPF demanded the right of Rwanda's refugees to return home. When political negotiation failed, they chose military action. On 1st October 1990, the RPF fighters crossed into northern Rwanda from Uganda. The civil war had begun. This shocked the Rwanda government. Habi Arimana portrayed the RPF as a foreign-backed force seeking to restore Tutsi domination. France, Belgium sent forces to support the Rwanda government, help to stop the initial RPF advance. But the consequences inside Rwanda were devastating. Tutsi civilians were increasingly treated as potential enemies. Thousands were arrested, were beaten, imprisoned, or killed simply because of their ethnicity or suspected sympathy with the RPF. The distinctions between Tutsi civilians and RPF fighters became deliberately blurred. At the same time, the Rwanda government expanded its military dramatically. Weapons were imported, training expanded, and party-aligned militias were strengthened. The war eventually reached a stalemate. Neither side could win outright, but the war had created a perfect environment for extremists to argue that Rwanda was fighting for its survival. Under pressure from international donors and opposition politicians, Habi Arimanas was eventually forced to accept political reforms. Opposition parties were legalized. Negotiation with the RPF began, and after months of talks in Arusha, Tanzania, the government and RPF signed the Arusha Accords on 4th August 1993. The agreement provided for a ceasefire, power sharing, democratic election, and the integration of RPF forces into a national army. Third, nation's peacekeeping mission was deployed to help oversee the agreement. For many Rwandans, peace finally seemed possible, but powerful extremists saw the agreement very differently. To them, sharing power with the RPF meant surrendering the political and military control they had built, and so an extremist ideology known as the Hutu power became increasingly influential. Its message was brutal, simple. The Tutsi were the enemy. Two who cooperated with them were traitors, and Rwanda had to be defended before it was supposedly taken over. Propaganda became central to this campaign. The newspaper, the Kangaroo, published anti-Tutsi material, including the infamous Hutu Ten Commandment. Then came radio. The RTLM began broadcasting. It sounded different from conventional government propaganda. It played music, it joked, entertained. Presenters sounded like ordinary people, having conversations with their listeners. But beneath the entertainment was a campaign of hatred. Tutsi were repeatedly described as inyenzi, cockroaches. Moderates were attacked. Fear were repeated until it became normal. Spread across the country, youth militias were organized. The MRND supported the Interahamwe, while the extremist CDR party had the Impunza Mugambi. Young men were recruited, trained, and armed. Weapons, including firearms, grenades, clubs, and machetes, were distributed. Local authorities compiled information about political opponents, moderate Hutu, human rights activists, and Tutsi family. The country was moving towards something catastrophic, and some people outside Rwanda knew it. Nation Peacekeeping Mission Commander Major General Romeo Delary became increasingly concerned. Informants warned him that the extremist militias were stockpiling weapons and preparing to attack Tutsi civilians and political opponents. In January 1994, Delary sent a warning to UN headquarters detailing information about planned violence. He wanted stronger action, but United Nations refused to authorize the kind of intervention he sought. The peacekeeping mandate remained severely limited. Meanwhile, negotiations were collapsing. Roadblocks were becoming more common, extremists were becoming more confident, and Rwanda was approaching the point of no return. On 6th April 1994, everything changed. President Habyarimana was returning from regional peace summit in Tanzania as his Falcon 50 approached Kigali. Two missiles struck the aircraft. The plane crashed within the grounds of the president's residence. Habyarimana was dead. Burundi President Cyprien was also killed. Who fired those two missiles remain one of the most disputed questions surrounding the genocide. Within hours, roadblocks appeared across Kigali. Government soldiers, the President Guard, and militia members moved into position. The first targets were not even Tutsi civilians, they were moderate Hutu politicians who supported the peace process. Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana was also murdered. 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers assigned to protect her were also captured, tortured, and killed. Belgium withdrew its force instead of reinforcing the UNAMIR. The international community drastically reduced the peacekeeping mission. The killing accelerated. Identity cards became instruments of threat. At roadblocks, people identified as Tutsi were stopped and killed. Families were murdered inside their homes, churches, schools, hospitals, and other places where civilians sought refuge became sites of massacre. Women and girls were subjected to widespread sexual violence. Children were killed alongside their parents. RTLM helped coordinate the atmosphere of terror, sometimes identifying people in hidden and encouraging listeners to kill them. The propaganda had become action, the hatred had become murder. But even in the middle of the genocide, there were people who resisted. Some Hutu families hid Tutsi neighbors despite the danger. Some priests, teachers, officials, civilians, and peacekeepers protected people at enormous personal risk. This UN peacekeeper, Captain Mbaye Diane, reportedly rescued civilians from danger, often passing through militia checkpoints without weapons. At the Hotel des Mille Collines, more than 1,000 people survived because those protecting them refused to abandon them. Meanwhile, the RPF resumed its military offensive. Paul Kagame forces advanced steadily, defeating government forces and capturing territory. As the RPF advanced, hundreds of thousands of Hutu civilians fled towards neighboring countries, including Tanzania, fear of reprisals, and as government and militia leaders encouraged the exodus. On 4th July 1994, the RPF captured Kigali. The government forces collapsed, and on 18th July, the RPF declared the war over. The genocide had ended. In roughly 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people had been killed. The majority were Tutsi. Thousands of moderate Hutu were also murdered. Entire families had disappeared. Communities had been destroyed. And millions of Rwandans were displaced. But ending the killing did not mean ending the consequences. Rwanda then had to rebuild a country devastated by war and genocide. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda prosecuted senior figures responsible for the genocide. Inside Rwanda, the government established community courts to process enormous numbers of genocide related cases. The country also attempted to rebuild national identity by removing ethnic classification from official identity cards and emphasizing a shared Rwanda identity. Every year, Rwanda observed Kwibuka, a period of remembrance honoring those who were murdered. The country has since achieved significant economic growth, improved infrastructure, and relative political stability. I tell the stories all the time. Please do like, share, comment. Thank you so much for listening.